Okay, I know I lie sometimes, but I promise this is going to be the last video of the week. So far as you've been watching these videos, you've noticed I've been using numbers as my examples. But we can actually represent a lot more than just numbers using our variables. In fact, there's 3 data types that we're going to talk about today that are pretty much the fundamental data types of Python. That's not necessarily true. There are more we're going to talk about in the coming weeks, but we're focusing on these 3 in this video. The first are integers, and those are the counting numbers, things that go from negative some very large whole number to positive some very large whole number. And I focus on the word whole number here because they are whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, negative 10, negative 11, those kinds of numbers. The second are floating point or floating point decimal or decimal numbers. As we know, there are really infinite numbers between 1 and 2, negative 3 and negative 4, but we need another data type to represent them just for computational reasons. The last data type that we're going to talk about are strings, which are decidedly not numeric. You saw this in the last video when I did this. I had the distinction between printing the characters in quotes and printing the variable name to get the value of coffees. The first one I said, well, if you do that, you're actually going to get the letters in order. And the second one, you're actually going to get a value because it's the name of a variable. The first one is a string. That's an example of what it is. And it's essentially just a group of characters put in a very specific order. Now, these characters can contain numbers. For example, something like this is an alternate spelling of the word coffees that contains some numbers which are not really numeric in this case. They're actually the symbols for like the number 3 or the number 5. So that's an important distinction. And it really comes into play when you look at the last piece of code I did in the previous video, where I created my self-reporting program in which I used the input function, again, a productive function that actually does something for us, to set the value of the variable coffees. Let's have a look. So why is this important? Why am I talking about this? You have experience with decimals and you have an experience with integers, and you know what happens if you add an integer to a decimal or a decimal to an integer or 2 decimals together or 2 integers together. You essentially get either an integer or a decimal depending on the arrangement that you are using there. However, with strings, it becomes a little complicated. For example, my input function. My input function always returns a string. When I say returns, it always produces a string. So when I type the number 4 at the prompt, it's not actually the number 4. It's the symbol for the number 4, which is actually a character. So if I were to try to do something like this, it would actually give me an error because I can't do the math with a character. I actually have to have a number. So that shows us something. That says that we can do something with our various data types in order to make them useful. Because I wouldn't show you something and say, well, there's no practical purpose for that. We can't really do anything with it. We can do something with it. And that's another thing called casting or conversion. We can take an integer and turn it into a decimal. We can take a decimal, turn it into an integer. If, in fact, a string is a number, we can turn it into an actual numeric value rather than just a character. So if I wanted to do this work, if I wanted to write that program that would just automatically increment 1 to the number that I reported at the prompt, I would have to do something about that. I would somehow have to introduce another command or another instruction in order to take that variable from a string type to an integer type. So to convert that symbol actually into a number. And we're going to learn another function which is productive here, which is the int function, which allows us to take anything that could possibly be an integer and turn it into an integer itself. One final thing before you go. I want to have a look at a peculiar behavior that happens when you actually divide 2 numbers. And this is something called promotion, which is a kind of conversion, but it does not require a function, and it actually happens automatically. So when you divide any 2 integers, you would normally think of something like this resulting in what answer? And normally that would be correct. However, when it comes to our programming we are going to do in this class, in Python in specific, it actually turns into the number 2.0. And that's because when you divide any 2 numbers in Python, you get a decimal regardless of whether or not they were both integers. So it's a kind of conversion that you can do without actually doing something like a function in order to change the variable. It just sort of automatically happens. And believe it or not, that's actually the end of everything that you need to know in order to approach the next week of Computer Science 100. It's not a lot, and it doesn't seem like an extremely powerful thing. But as you will see when we get to our lab, just this short amount of knowledge allows you to do pretty powerful problem solving. And I look forward to doing that with you.